You think you could survive as a samurai? You wouldn't last until breakfast. These weren't elegant warriors. They were starving, sleep-deprived killers trained to commit suicide before they learned to read. A child could be ordered to disembowel himself. A wife executed for speaking too loudly. A soldier told to kill his best friend just to prove loyalty. The code of honor? That was just camouflage for a society so brutal even death was considered a mercy. What you're about to see will ruin every fantasy you've ever had about the samurai. And you'll never look at them the same way again. Welcome to Japan, 1185 to 1868. For nearly 7 centuries, the samurai weren't just warriors. They were the absolute ruling class of one of history's most hierarchical societies. Picture a world where your social status determined not just your wealth or your job, but whether you lived or died, whether you could speak or had to remain silent, whether you deserved food or should starve. The samurai controlled everything. They owned the land, commanded the armies, wrote the laws, and enforced them with a brutality that would make modern dictators blush. But here's the twisted irony. While they wielded absolute power over everyone else, they lived under a code so merciless that it made their own lives a daily nightmare of potential death. This isn't the Japan of cherry blossoms and tea ceremonies. This is the Japan of public executions, ritual suicide, and a social order built on the simple principle that human life was expendable. The Tokugawa shogunate didn't just rule through fear, they institutionalized terror, made it part of daily existence, and convinced an entire nation that this was not just normal but noble. In this world, a samurai child learned to hold a sword before they could properly walk. They memorized death poems before they learned their alphabet, and they understood that honor wasn't something you earned, it was something you died for, and if you weren't ready to die at any moment, you weren't worthy of calling yourself human. The dawn of agony. Your day as a samurai begins at 4 a.m., not because you want to, but because sleeping past dawn was considered a moral failing that could result in public humiliation or worse. But this isn't just an early wake-up call, it's the beginning of 18 hours of potential death. The first thing you do isn't check your phone or grab coffee. You kneel in Seiza position, sitting on your heels with your back perfectly straight, for 30 minutes of meditation. Sounds peaceful? Your legs go numb within minutes, your back screams in pain, but moving, shifting, or showing any sign of discomfort marks you as weak, undisciplined, unworthy. Takeda Shingen, one of the most feared daimyo of the 16th century, reportedly had his retainers beaten unconscious if they so much as adjusted their posture during morning meditation. Archaeological evidence from samurai residences shows wooden knots embedded in tatami mats. These weren't decorations, they were to ensure perfect kneeling posture. Shift too much, and the knots would dig into your legs until they bled. But the meditation isn't about peace or enlightenment. It's about preparing your mind for the very real possibility that you might have to kill someone today, or that someone might kill you. As you kneel there, legs going numb, back aching, you recite your death poem. The haiku that will be your final words when you commit seppuku. Yes, every samurai had to memorize their own death poem. Children as young as 7 were required to compose verses about their willingness to die. Because in this world, death wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you were expected to choose eagerly, joyfully, the moment your honor was questioned. And your day has just begun. Breakfast of champions if you're lucky. After meditation comes breakfast, assuming you deserve one. Food wasn't a right for the samurai, it was a privilege that had to be earned through perfect behavior. And perfect was a standard that changed daily, arbitrarily, based on the whims of your superiors. The typical samurai meal consisted of rice, miso soup, and pickled vegetables. No meat, Buddhism forbade it. No variety, discipline demanded simplicity, no seconds. Gluttony was a sin punishable by public humiliation. But here's what really separated the samurai from every other culture's warrior class. They weaponized starvation as a form of spiritual training. Fasting was mandatory, not occasional fasting for religious purposes, but systematic starvation designed to bring you closer to death, to make you comfortable with suffering, to ensure that physical pain never distracted you from your duties. Historical records from the Kamakura period show that samurai were expected to fast for 7 consecutive days, at least 4 times per year. Not reduce their food, eliminate it entirely. Minamoto Yoshitsune, the legendary warrior who helped establish the Kamakura shogunate, reportedly went without food for 11 days while planning the Battle of Dan no Ura in 1185. When his retainers begged him to eat, he had 3 of them executed for questioning his discipline. Their heads were displayed outside his tent as a reminder that survival was less important than spiritual purity. But even when you were allowed to eat, the ritual was designed to humiliate you. You ate in complete silence. You finished everything, even if it made you sick. Wasting food was disrespectful to the gods and your lord. You ate with perfect posture, never touching the bowl with your lips, never making a sound. And if you showed too much enjoyment, if you ate too quickly or too slowly, or your face showed any expression of pleasure or displeasure, that was evidence of spiritual weakness. And weakness in a samurai wasn't just shameful, it was grounds for forced seppuku. Training that would break your mind. After breakfast, if you earned one, came training. But samurai training wasn't about building muscle or improving technique. It was about systematically destroying every instinct for self-preservation you possessed and replacing it with an automated willingness to die. Physical training began with wooden swords called bokken, but these weren't practice weapons. They were instruments of torture disguised as education. Training sessions lasted 6 to 8 hours without breaks. No water, no rest, no mercy. Students practiced the same strike thousands of times until their hands bled. Their arms went numb, and their minds entered a trance-like state of pure, mindless repetition. Miyamoto Musashi, perhaps the most famous samurai swordsman in history, described training sessions where students would practice until they collapsed from exhaustion, then continue training while unconscious. His treatise, The Book of 5 Rings, written in 1645, details exercises where warriors would practice sword cuts while having bamboo stakes driven through their feet to simulate the pain of battle. But physical training was nothing compared to mental conditioning. Samurai children were locked in rooms with decomposing corpses to overcome their fear of death. They were forced to execute prisoners, not enemy soldiers but civilians, including women and children, to desensitize them to killing. Archaeological evidence from training grounds shows small graves containing the remains of hundreds of practice victims. The most brutal training exercise was called kimodameshi, literally test of courage. Young samurai were sent alone to graveyards at midnight and ordered to bring back proof they had been there, usually a piece of clothing or hair from a fresh corpse. But the real test wasn't overcoming fear of the supernatural. It was conditioning them to be comfortable with death, to see corpses as normal, to eliminate any squeamishness about violence. And this wasn't occasional training. This was daily life, from childhood until death. Because a samurai who hesitated, who showed mercy, who valued his own life above his duty, wasn't just a bad warrior. He was a monster who brought shame on his entire bloodline. The economics of honor? But here's what movies never tell you about samurai life. Most of them were desperately poor. The warrior class might have had absolute social authority, but they lived in economic misery that would make modern poverty look like luxury. Samurai weren't allowed to work. Commerce was beneath them. They couldn't farm. That was peasant work. They couldn't craft. That was artisan work. They couldn't trade. That was merchant work. Their only legitimate source of income was their stipend from their daimyo lord, and for most samurai that stipend barely covered survival. Historical records from the Edo period show that lower-ranking samurai lived on rice allowances equivalent to about $50 per month in modern currency. They wore the same clothes for years, patched and repatched until they fell apart. They lived in homes that were barely larger than closets, with no heating in winter, no cooling in summer. But poverty wasn't just uncomfortable. It was another form of spiritual training. Samurai were taught that material comfort corrupted the soul, that suffering purified the spirit, that the more miserable your physical existence, the more noble your character became. Takeda Nobukado, a famous samurai general of the 16th century, lived for 20 years in a room so small he couldn't lie down fully. He slept sitting up, owned 2 sets of clothes, and ate 1 meal per day. When his lord offered him a larger house as a reward for military service, Nobukado refused, saying that comfort would make him weak. Historical accounts suggest he lived this way voluntarily as a form of ongoing spiritual discipline. But here's the truly twisted part. While individual samurai lived in poverty, they were still expected to maintain the appearance of wealth and status. Their swords had to be perfectly maintained. Their armor had to be spotless. Their horses, if they could afford horses, had to be well fed and groomed. This meant that many samurai spent more money caring for their weapons than feeding their families. They starved their children to polish their blades. They let their wives wear rags while they maintained perfect ceremonial armor they might never use in battle. Because in samurai culture, appearances weren't just important, they were literally matters of life and death. The women who chose death. If life was brutal for male samurai, it was unimaginably worse for the women in their families. Samurai women weren't just subjected to the same harsh discipline as men. They faced additional layers of suffering specifically designed around their gender. Meet the Onabu geisha, female samurai warriors who were trained to kill and expected to die with the same merciless efficiency as their male counterparts. But their training included something men's didn't: systematic preparation for rape, torture, and sexual humiliation, because in feudal warfare, women warriors were specifically targeted for psychological warfare. Tomoe Gozen, who fought in the Genpei War of 1180 to 1185, was reportedly trained from childhood to withstand sexual torture without breaking. Historical accounts describe training exercises where young Onabu geisha were subjected to simulated assault to prepare them for capture. The goal wasn't to teach them to escape or resist, it was to ensure they would choose suicide rather than endure dishonor. And they did choose suicide, not just occasionally as a last resort, but regularly, routinely, for reasons that would seem trivial to modern minds. A samurai woman who spoke too loudly in public might commit jigai, ritual female suicide, by cutting the throat with a small blade called a kaiken. A woman who showed interest in a man not approved by her family might disembowel herself with a tanto dagger. A woman who bore only daughters instead of sons might choose death rather than face the shame of disappointing her husband. But the most horrific aspect of samurai women's lives was their complete lack of legal existence. They couldn't own property, couldn't make decisions about their own lives, couldn't even choose their own deaths without permission from male relatives. If a samurai woman wanted to commit suicide to preserve her honor, she first had to get written approval from her father or husband. Hojo Masako, wife of the first Kamakura shogun, was one of the most powerful women in Japanese history. She effectively ruled Japan for 20 years after her husband's death. But even she was required to request permission before making any major decisions, including decisions about her own life and death. When she finally died in 1225, historical records suggest it was by ritual suicide, performed only after receiving written approval from the imperial court. These weren't isolated incidents, they were systematic, institutionalized, and considered normal. In samurai culture, women choosing death over dishonor wasn't a tragedy. It was Tuesday. Children of the blade. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of samurai brutality was how they treated their own children. From the moment a samurai child could walk, they were subjected to conditioning that would be considered torture by any modern standard. Samurai children began weapons training at age 3. Not pretend training with toy weapons, but real training with real blades that could and did cause serious injury. Historical records from the Muromachi period describe training accidents where children as young as 5 died from sword cuts during practice sessions. These deaths weren't considered tragedies. They were proof that the children were training hard enough. But physical training was just the beginning. Samurai children were systematically traumatized to eliminate normal emotional responses. They were forced to watch public executions not from a distance, but close enough to be splattered with blood. They were required to touch severed heads, to sleep with weapons, to compose death poems before they could write their own names. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the founder of the Tokugawa shogunate, reportedly had his son Nobuyasu killed when the boy showed reluctance to execute prisoners. Nobuyasu was forced to commit seppuku at age 21, not for any crime or failure in battle, but because his father detected a lack of sufficient bloodthirst in his character. The educational system was designed around a simple principle. Childhood was a weakness that needed to be eliminated as quickly as possible. Samurai children had no toys except weapons, no games except combat drills, no stories except tales of glorious death in battle. They learned to read by studying military manuals. They learned to write by copying suicide poems. And if they showed any sign of normal childhood behavior, if they cried, if they expressed fear, if they showed affection for pets or friends, that was evidence of spiritual corruption that needed to be beaten out of them. Archaeological evidence from samurai households includes small restraining devices designed to hold children motionless during punishment. Training implements specifically sized for child hands, and graves of children who died during character-building exercises. By age 10, a samurai child was expected to be mentally and emotionally indistinguishable from an adult warrior. They should be willing to kill without hesitation, die without complaint, and view suffering as their natural state. If they couldn't meet these standards, they weren't considered failed children. They were considered failed human beings who brought shame on their entire bloodline. The art of beautiful death. But all of this brutality, all of this systematic torture disguised as honor, was building toward one ultimate moment, the perfect death. Because in samurai culture, how you died wasn't just important, it was the only thing that mattered. Your entire life was merely preparation for the final few minutes when you would demonstrate your spiritual purity by destroying yourself in the most agonizing way possible. Seppuku wasn't just suicide, it was performance art. The condemned samurai would spend days preparing, not just mentally, but choreographically. Every movement was rehearsed, every cut was planned, every facial expression was practiced in mirrors to ensure it conveyed the proper combination of serenity and determination. The ritual began with purification. The samurai would fast for 3 days, bathe in ice-cold water, dress in pure white clothing, and arrange his hair in a traditional top knot. He would write final poems, distribute his possessions, and say goodbye to family members. Though showing too much emotion during these farewells was considered spiritually corrupt. On the day of death, the samurai knelt on a white cloth in front of witnesses. A small blade called a tanto was placed before him on a wooden stand. The kaishakunin, his designated executioner, stood behind him with a katana ready to decapitate him the moment the disembowelment began. But here's what makes seppuku truly horrific. The samurai had to remain conscious and composed while disemboweling himself. The cut wasn't quick or merciful, it was slow, deliberate, and designed to cause maximum pain while demonstrating maximum self-control. The blade entered just below the navel, moved horizontally across the abdomen, then upward toward the chest. Throughout this process, which could take several minutes, the samurai was expected to maintain perfect posture, controlled breathing, and a serene expression. Minamoto Tametomo, a legendary samurai of the 12th century, reportedly completed his seppuku cut, removed his own intestines with his bare hands, and arranged them neatly beside his body before allowing his kaishakunin to decapitate him. Historical accounts suggest he remained conscious and alert throughout the entire process, even offering commentary on his own technique. And this wasn't just how samurai died in battle or disgrace. This was how they chose to die when they felt their honor had been stained, when they had disappointed their lord, when they were growing old, when their wife had been unfaithful, when their children had failed to meet expectations. Any excuse was good enough because living was always less honorable than dying beautifully. The most disturbing aspect, children as young as 12 were taught to perform seppuku. Historical records document cases of samurai boys committing ritual suicide rather than face punishment for minor infractions like speaking disrespectfully to an adult or failing to memorize a poem correctly. This wasn't madness. This wasn't a breakdown of social order. This was the social order functioning exactly as designed, a culture that had elevated suffering to the level of art, death to the level of worship, and brutality to the level of spiritual discipline. So there you have it, 24 hours in the life of a samurai, if you could even survive that long. From the agonizing meditation at dawn to the constant possibility of ritual suicide at sunset, every moment was designed around a simple principle. Human life has value only when it's willingly destroyed. This wasn't an honor. This was systematic psychological torture disguised as spiritual discipline. These weren't noble warriors, they were products of a culture so traumatized, so damaged, so fundamentally broken that they convinced themselves suffering was sacred and death was the highest achievement possible. The samurai didn't create a warrior culture. They created a death cult with swords. They didn't preserve honor, they perverted it into a justification for institutionalized brutality. They didn't protect Japan. They terrorized it for 7 centuries while calling themselves noble. But here's the question that should haunt you. How many of our modern ideas about honor, discipline, and sacrifice are just prettier versions of the same twisted logic? How many times do we glorify suffering, romanticize hardship, and convince ourselves that pain is somehow purifying? The samurai believed that life was only valuable when you were willing to throw it away. They taught their children that love was weakness, that comfort was corruption, that the highest virtue was the ability to destroy yourself beautifully. What would happen if we took that same logic and applied it to modern life? What would happen if we decided that success was only meaningful if it involved systematic self-destruction? What would happen if we taught our children that their worth was measured by their willingness to suffer? Actually, don't answer that. Look around you. Maybe we already have. What other historical cultures do you think hid their brutality behind beautiful philosophies? What other warrior classes convinced themselves that systematic torture was actually spiritual enlightenment? Let me know in the comments below, and maybe we'll explore another civilization that chose beautiful suffering over messy happiness. But fair warning, once you start seeing through the mythology, once you start recognizing how cultures use honor and tradition to justify the unjustifiable, you can never go back to the comfortable lies. You'll start seeing the samurai in every system that glorifies sacrifice, every culture that worships hardship, every society that convinces its people that their suffering serves some higher purpose.